Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. You know we love to dig into the details on this show, and today we're really focusing on something that's just so vital for any organization to operate effectively, and that is risk governance.
Absolutely.
And we've got some great material to really unpack here. We're going to be looking at some excerpts from Pritesh Biswas's ERM Chapter 6. Risk Governance 1.
A good one.
Yeah. This is really a great chapter, packed with some really interesting stuff. And our mission today is really to understand how organizations make sure that they are making responsible decisions, that they are managing risks effectively, and that they're really safeguarding their future.
Yeah.
But also, keeping in mind all the interests of the different stakeholders that they have.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's not just about, one single group.
Right.
It's about everybody that's impacted by the organization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore everything from, the responsibilities at the highest level of the boardroom to the really, diverse approaches to governance that we see around the world.
Right. There is no one size fits all.
No, not at all. So, to kick things off, maybe we can just start with the basics. What exactly is corporate governance?
Well, according to Biswas, corporate governance is defined as the manner in which companies are directed and the objectives they pursue. He goes on to say that it clarifies who holds authority and responsibility and who is tasked with decision making.
Okay, so it's sort of like a framework for accountability within the organization.
Yeah, exactly. And it really aims to ensure that decisions are made and actions are carried out responsibly so that an organization can achieve success in the long term.
So it's not just about making money, it's about how you make that money and how sustainable the whole enterprise is.
Right. And importantly, it considers the interests of all stakeholders. This could include shareholders, employees, suppliers, customers, and even the wider community.
Right. Everyone who's affected by the decisions that are made. And that applies to all types of organizations, right? It's not just companies that are publicly traded. This also applies to private companies, nonprofits, charities.
Absolutely. Any organization, regardless of size or structure, can benefit from having good corporate governance in place.
Right, because even a small charity needs to be accountable, needs to have a framework for making decisions.
Definitely. Now, the source we're looking at today touches on some of the historical context of corporate governance.
Okay.
And it mentions that in the UK, there were a few events that really shaped their approach to corporate governance.
Interesting. What happened?
Well, in the early 1990s, there were a series of high-profile corporate collapses in the UK. And even though many companies were actually well managed, these collapses really prompted a need to take a closer look at governance practices.
It's interesting how those types of big events sometimes force change.
It does.
Yeah.
So, as a direct response to these failures, the Cadbury Code of Best Practice was introduced in 1992.
Okay. And what was the purpose of that?
It was a collaborative effort that aimed to establish standards for effective board functioning. Really to clarify, oversight responsibilities and how to manage risk effectively.
So they basically said, all right, we need some rules of the road here.
Exactly. We need some guidelines to help companies avoid making those same mistakes.
Right. To prevent future collapses.
Exactly. And the Cadbury Code actually went on to evolve into something called the Turnbull Report in 1999.
Okay. And what did the Turnbull Report focus on?
This report was specifically geared towards directors of listed companies, and it provided guidance on setting up robust risk management and internal control systems. And it was really instrumental in shaping the current iteration of the UK Corporate Governance Code, which was published in 2018.
Okay. So this 2018 code, is that the main framework that's used in the UK today?
It is.
Okay.
And this code actually defines corporate governance as, and I quote, the system by which companies are directed and controlled. It basically emphasizes that strong governance is absolutely essential for companies to be successful and to thrive in the long run.
Right. It's like the foundation upon which everything else is built.
Exactly.
So let's dive into the specifics of this UK Corporate Governance Code. What are some of the key elements that it lays out?
Okay. So the UK Corporate Governance Code is structured around several key principles. And the first one is board leadership and company purpose.
Okay. What does that mean?
So this principle highlights the board's responsibility to promote sustainable success over the long term. And they do this by defining the company's purpose, making sure their values and culture are embedded throughout the organization, and actively engaging with all stakeholders.
Okay, so it's about setting the tone from the top.
Right. And it's a big shift from just focusing on shareholder value to considering all the different stakeholders who are impacted by the company's actions.
Yeah. Which can be tricky, Because sometimes those interests can be in conflict.
They definitely can be.
Right. So how do organizations actually navigate that in practice? How do they balance those different interests?
That is a really good question. It requires a lot of careful consideration, open communication, and a willingness to compromise. But it's definitely a key challenge that boards need to address.
It sounds like it.
Now, the second principle is the division of responsibilities.
Okay.
And this principle emphasizes the importance of having a clear separation between the roles of the chair and the CEO.
Why is that separation important?
It's all about preventing any one individual from having too much power.
Okay. So it's about checks and balances.
Exactly. The chair's role is to lead the board and ensure there's open and constructive discussion.
Okay.
While the CEO focuses on managing the day-to-day operations of the company.
I see.
And independent non-executive directors, or NEDs, also play a crucial role here. They provide objective judgment and challenge to the board's decisions. They bring in a fresh perspective because they're not involved in the day-to-day running of the company. And the company secretary also plays a really important role.
Right, to make sure all the governance processes are followed correctly.
Exactly.
So that's the division of responsibilities. What's the next key element?
The third principle is composition, succession, and evaluation.
Okay.
This one focuses on making sure the board has the right mix of skills, experience, and diversity to be effective.
Right, so you need people with different backgrounds and perspectives to make good decisions.
Absolutely. And the code actually recommends that at least 50% of the board, excluding the chair, should be independent NEDs.
Wow. So a strong emphasis on those external perspectives.
Yeah. And it also stresses the importance of having annual board evaluations to assess their effectiveness.
Okay. So it's not just about having the right people, but also making sure they're working well together.
Right. And it also highlights the need for solid succession plans. This ensures continuity of leadership if someone leaves or retires.
Makes sense. So what's the fourth key element?
This one is audit, risk, and internal control.
Okay. This is getting closer to what we're really talking about today.
It is. This principle is all about making sure that the board is setting up and overseeing robust risk management and internal control systems.
So it's about putting in place the mechanisms to identify, assess, and manage risks.
Right. And it requires companies to have an independent audit committee, which should be made up of NEDs.
Okay. Why is it important for the audit committee to be independent?
Well, it helps to ensure that the audit function is truly objective, and that they can provide an unbiased assessment of the company's financial reporting and internal controls.
Right. Because if they were part of the management team, there might be some conflict of interest.
Exactly.
Okay. So robust risk management, independent audit committee, anything else?
Transparent financial reporting is also key.
Of course.
And it emphasizes the need for effective audits, both internal and external.
So multiple layers of oversight to make sure things are running smoothly.
Exactly.
Okay. And what's the last key element of the code?
The final principle is remuneration.
Okay. Executive pay.
Yes. The code emphasizes that executive pay should be aligned with the company's purpose, values, and long-term strategy.
So it's not just about how much money they make, but also how that pay is structured and what it incentivizes.
Right. The Remuneration Committee, which again is made up of independent NEDs, is responsible for overseeing pay policies.
Okay.
And these policies should include performance-related incentives that don't encourage excessive risk-taking.
Right. You don't want to create a system where executives are rewarded for taking huge risks that could jeopardize the company in the long run.
Exactly. And pay policies must be transparent and fair. They need to consider the broader workforce within the organization and not just the executives at the top.
That makes sense. So how does this UK corporate governance code actually get implemented? Is it legally binding?
Well, the UK takes what's called a comply or explain approach.
Okay. What does that mean?
It means companies that are listed on the London Stock Exchange are required to either comply with the code's principles or provide a clear explanation in their annual report for any deviations.
I see. So they have to justify why they're not following the code.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while the code isn't legally enforceable in the same way that a law is, there's a lot of pressure to comply. Investors and stakeholders pay close attention to those explained statements.
Right. Because if a company is constantly deviating from the code, it could raise some red flags.
Absolutely.
Okay. So transparency and accountability are built into the system.
They are. And the focus really is on creating a culture of integrity, accountability, or considering all stakeholders.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier that one of the principles in the code is especially relevant to risk professionals.
Right. That would be Principle O.
Okay. And what does Principle O say?
Well, It states that the board should establish procedures to manage risk, oversee the internal control framework, and determine the nature and extent of the principal risks the company is willing to take to achieve its long-term objectives.
Okay. So it's basically saying the board needs to be actively involved in risk management. They can't just delegate it to someone else and forget about it.
Right.
And you use the term principal risks. What are those?
So the code defines principal risks pretty broadly. They include threats to the company's business model, future performance, solvency, liquidity, and reputation.
Okay. So pretty much anything that could significantly impact the company's ability to achieve its objectives.
Exactly. But it's interesting to note that while the focus is often on these potential downsides, the code also recognizes that boards should consider risks that could present big opportunities.
Right. So not all risks are bad. Some risks could actually lead to positive outcomes if they're managed properly.
Absolutely.
And while this UK code is primarily aimed at listed companies, its influence extends beyond that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. While it's a requirement for entities listed on the London Stock Exchange, many of its principles have been adopted and adapted by private companies, charities, public sector organizations, and internationally as well.
I see. So it's kind of become a benchmark for good governance practices.
You could say that. And the source actually highlights another set of principles, the Waits Corporate Governance Principles for Large Private Companies. These were introduced in 2018 and aim to enhance transparency and accountability within larger private firms, recognizing their significant economic and social impact.
Right. Because even if a company isn't publicly traded, it can still have a huge influence on society.
Definitely.
Now, we touched on the concept of materiality earlier in relation to the code.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on what materiality means in the context of governance?
Traditionally, materiality has been understood in financial terms. It basically means information that's significant enough to potentially impact an organization's financial health or influence the decisions of investors.
Okay. So anything that could affect the bottom line.
Right. Or that could lead an investor to make a different decision about whether to invest in the company.
Got it.
However, there's a growing recognition that materiality is more than just a financial concept.
Okay. How so?
Well, there's increasing emphasis on sustainability. That means considering factors beyond pure profit, like social and environmental capital.
Right. A company's impact on the world around it.
Exactly. And this concept of double materiality really broadens the scope of what can be considered material.
So it's not just about how risks affect the company financially, but also how the company affects society and the environment.
Right.
Okay. Now, we talked about the UK's comply or explain approach to corporate governance.
Yes.
The source contrasts this with a prescriptive-based approach. Can you explain the key differences between these two?
Sure. The main difference lies in the nature of the requirements, whether they're desired principles or mandatory rules. So the UK's principles-based approach basically outlines the desired outcomes and encourages organizations to achieve them in a way that works best for their specific circumstances.
So it's more about flexibility and adaptation.
Right. But they have to explain any deviations from those principles.
I see.
Now, a prescriptive-based approach, on the other hand, involves specific rules that are legally mandated.
Okay. So it's more black and white. You either comply or you don't.
Right. And there are often penalties for non-compliance.
Okay. So what are the pros and cons of each approach?
Well, the UK approach emphasizes high-quality reporting and genuine consideration of those underlying principles. It's not just about ticking boxes. Companies need to really think about how those principles apply to their unique situation.
Right.
However, some argue that a highly prescriptive approach can lead to that box-ticking mentality.
Okay. How so?
Well, organizations might focus on strictly adhering to the letter of the law, potentially even looking for loopholes, rather than truly embedding good governance practices into their culture and operations.
I see. So it becomes more about compliance than about actually doing the right thing.
Right. And the U.S., with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was enacted after the Enron and WorldCom scandals, is often cited as an example of a more prescriptive system.
Right. Big corporate failures often lead to stricter regulations. So we've looked at the UK and the US. What about other parts of the world? Is there any kind of global consensus on corporate governance?
While there isn't a single universally binding global standard, most countries do have their own corporate governance frameworks, and they take a variety of approaches.
Okay. So there's no one size fits all.
Right. The Singapore Corporate Governance Code is quite similar to the UK model.
Okay.
And the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance serve as a widely recognized framework that many nations draw upon, although they are voluntary.
So more of a set of guidelines than strict regulations. Can you give us a few examples of how different countries approach corporate governance?
Sure. So in France, corporate governance is a mix of legal requirements, which are embedded in the French Commercial Code, and recommendations from business associations, which operate on a comply or explain basis.
Okay.
Germany has laws that pertain specifically to listed companies. And they also have the German Corporate Governance Code, which provides non-legally enforceable rules and recommendations.
I see.
And as we mentioned, the U.S. utilizes those NYSE listing mandates, along with the stricter requirements of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
Okay.
And South Africa's King the Fief Corporate Governance Code uses an apply and explain approach.
Okay. What does that mean?
It means companies need to not only explain any deviations from the code, but also provide insight into how they are implementing their governance practices.
So it's even more focused on transparency and accountability.
It is.
So a real spectrum of approaches around the world.
Definitely.
Now, that ultimate responsibility for governance and the strategic direction.
And you've got two main types of directors on a board. You've got your executive directors. They're the ones working full-time, like the CEO, CFO, other top managers. And then you've got the non-executive directors, the NEDs. They're not employees. They're there to provide that independent oversight, challenge the executives constructively. And while it's not always a legal requirement, best practice says you should have a majority of NEDs, especially for those unquoted or unregulated companies. It's about having that independent voice. And legally, the duties of both types of directors are pretty much the same.
And the way boards are structured can differ too, right? Like the unitary boards we see a lot in the UK and US versus the two-tiered systems that are more common in continental Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Those unitary boards, with everyone on the same board, they can have better information flow. NEDs are more involved in those strategic conversations, so decisions can be made faster. But sometimes it gets a bit blurry. Who's managing, who's supervising, and there's that risk of conflict of interest. Now, two-tiered systems, they separate things out. You've got a management board, all the executives, they handle day-to-day stuff. And then a supervisory board. With the NEDs, they oversee the management board. So more independence, more objectivity, and naturally the CEO and chair roles are separate. But these systems can get pretty big. Decisions might take longer, and there's still that question about NEDs' financial ties and whether that affects their independence.
Boards also typically have these committees to handle specific areas, right?
Yeah, exactly. Some are permanent, some are temporary, depending on what's needed. The UK Code says listed companies need 3 key committees. Nomination committee, they find and recommend people for board positions and figure out succession planning. Remuneration committee, they set the pay for those executive directors. And the audit committee, they look after financial reporting, internal controls, risk management, and the relationship with both the internal and external auditors.
Some organizations also have a dedicated risk management committee, right?
Right. They give the board specific advice and oversight on all things risk management. Risk appetite, how strategic changes affect the risk profile, spotting those emerging risks, stress testing, making sure the risk management and control frameworks are robust, and even whether the company culture and reward systems are aligned with their risk appetite.
So it's not like every board is structured exactly the same way.
No, not at all. Sometimes you see those responsibilities combined, like a nomination and remuneration committee, or even an audit and risk committee all rolled into one. And depending on the company, you might have even more specialized committees like for operations, sustainability, finance, maybe even a members committee for certain types of organizations. The key is that the structure should fit the organization and change as the company evolves and the world around them changes.
This then moves on to these regulatory influences, which are usually nationwide and come from these independent bodies or legal frameworks. Especially those public companies, they're under a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah, these bodies have the power to monitor everything and hand out penalties if companies don't comply. And there are 3 big players that BISWAS focuses on.
Mm-hmm.
The FRC in the UK, SOX in the US, and the OECD at the international level.
So starting with the FRC in the UK, they've gone through a big transformation since they started in the 1980s. It's gone from a mostly private sector thing to a fully independent regulator with a much wider scope.
It's exactly. Now they're responsible for auditors, accountants, actuaries, setting the standards for corporate governance, financial reporting, auditing, and most importantly, making sure all those professionals and companies are actually sticking to those standards. They really see themselves as crucial for building and maintaining public trust, which is essential for confidence in the UK's financial markets. It's a virtuous circle. Market confidence attracts investors, leading to better governance, better reporting, and all of that is backed up by really rigorous auditing.
And they're the ones behind the UK Corporate Governance Code, plus other important guidance like the guidance on board effectiveness and the weights principles. They put out a ton of information reports, procedures, regulations, frameworks, reviews, case studies for everyone involved. So yeah, they're really influential in the UK and even internationally.
Then you have SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the US. It came about in 2002 after those huge scandals, Enron, WorldCom, Global Crossing. It's a classic example of that compliance sign approach, forcing companies listed on U.S. exchanges to be accurate and reliable in their financial disclosures, and the penalties for not complying are serious. It really changed how corporate accountability works in the U.S.
And Biswas picks out sections 302 and 404 as especially important for risk management. Section 302 puts the CEO and CFO directly on the hook for accurate financial reports and effective internal controls over financial reporting. And Section 404 makes management responsible for checking and formally stating that their internal controls over financial reporting are good enough, and then external auditors have to verify that.
Yeah, it added a whole new level of responsibility. And SOX basically recommends the COSO ERM framework, enterprise risk management, as a good model for setting up and maintaining effective internal controls. It's had a huge and lasting impact on how companies in the U.S. manage risk and govern themselves. And interestingly, even in the U.K., there's been some movement towards SOX principles. People talk about UK SOX regulations, which have added more reporting requirements for directors, even though there isn't a specific law that mirrors SOX exactly.
And finally, there's the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a global nonprofit that sets international standards and policies for all sorts of things, including corporate governance.
Yeah, they have a three-pronged approach. They provide expert analysis and policy recommendations to member countries. They work with policymakers to get those best practices adopted, and they push for international standards. What's relevant for us is their guidelines on the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. They've been updating these over time, most recently emphasizing climate change and ESG risks, the impact of digital technologies, the need for strong risk and crisis management, and avoiding excessive risk-taking. And while the UK and the US are both members, following the guidelines isn't mandatory, but the OECD's recommendations carry a lot of weight and definitely influence how people think about and practice corporate governance all over the world.
Let's talk about the specific roles and responsibilities now, going beyond those basic legal and regulatory duties. So individual board members, particularly those non-executive directors, they need to bring that independent thinking and expertise to the table.
Right, it's not just about showing up. They have to provide effective oversight, challenge the executives, offer strategic guidance based on their experience, keep a close eye on the company's performance, contribute to setting those executive pay policies, use their networks to benefit the company, and really importantly, make sure the company's financial information is reliable and the risk management systems are strong. They also need to confirm that the company's reporting is accurate and the internal controls are robust and working properly. A big part of being an NED is being a constructive critic, especially when it comes to looking at financial data and evaluating how well those risk management systems are working, especially for the audit committee members.
And the board as a whole, as a group, they've got their own responsibilities for overseeing risk management and internal controls.
Yeah, they oversee the design, implementation, and effectiveness of the whole risk management and internal control system. They define the principal risks the organization faces and set the risk appetite, which is how much risk they're willing to take to achieve their goals. They also have to foster a risk-aware culture and make sure the reward systems don't encourage excessive risk-taking. It's about making those informed decisions about risk management and mitigation strategies, regularly checking how effective those risk and control systems are, and making sure there are clear communication channels about risk throughout the organization. And ultimately, they're the ones responsible for how the company talks about risk externally. It's the management team who actually puts those risk management strategies and controls into practice. But the board has to make sure they understand the key risks and that there are effective measures in place. They can't just sit back and listen to management reports. They have to actively question, scrutinize, and challenge the information they're given.
Biswas has some good questions for boards to think about regularly. What's the risk management culture like? How often and how deeply do we talk about risk at the board level? Do we have the right risk management expertise? Is the quality of risk information good enough? Who's responsible for what when it comes to risk? And how much assurance do we really need that our systems are working?
Yeah, it's all about asking those tough questions. And ultimately, Biswas says the board needs to answer one fundamental question. Given where we are now, our goals, the risks, and what our management team can do, are we confident we can achieve our objectives? And if the answer is no, the board has to act. That might mean tackling those risks more aggressively, adjusting their objectives, or even accepting certain levels of risk. It's about taking ownership of the organization's risk posture.
Now, there's also the role of the chief risk officer, the CRO, which seems to be getting more and more important.
Yeah, the CRO is like the champion for enterprise risk management, ERM. They try to bring all those different risk management approaches together into one cohesive view. They're all about making sure risks are identified, assessed, and handled properly across the entire organization, tracking progress, and making sure that crucial risk information gets to senior management and the board. They're usually the most senior person who's directly responsible for all those risk management processes, even though their exact title might be different in different companies.
And Biswas lists 4 main categories of duties for a CRO: providing insightful analysis and context on the organization's risks, contributing to strategy and performance management from a risk perspective, overseeing the risk management process itself, and building up the risk management functions, capabilities, and expertise.
Right, so it's a very broad role. And in some sectors, like financial services, having a CRO is actually mandatory. But even in other industries, it's becoming more common. It's a sign that the company takes risk management seriously. And for a CRO to be truly effective, they should report directly to both the CEO and the board. That way, they can give the board those unfiltered insights, have those direct conversations about the company's risks and how well the risk management is working. If the CRO doesn't have that access, it's much harder to influence decisions and make improvements. It's a complex role that needs to be carefully defined to avoid overlap and confusion. But a good CRO can make a huge difference. They can build strong relationships with external stakeholders, be a trusted advisor to the leadership team, build and lead ethical and proactive risk teams, help the board set the right tone and build a healthy risk culture, and help define that risk appetite and balance risk and reward in those big strategic decisions. There was a Deloitte survey in 2018 that showed how much more frequent and important those CRO board interactions are becoming.
Let's talk about assurance now. Biswas highlights how crucial internal audit is for providing independent assurance to the board and management, telling them how effective the control environment and risk management process is. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about assurance.
Okay.
The source talks about risk assurance. What exactly is that?
So risk assurance refers to the data and insights that the board and management receive about the effectiveness of the risk and control environment within the organization.
Okay. So it's about making sure that the system for managing risk is actually working.
Right. The board needs to have confidence that the risk strategy is actually being implemented and that it's effective.
Right. Because you can have the best plan in the world, but if it's not being put into practice, it's not going to do any good.
Exactly. And internal audit plays a big role in providing that assurance. External auditors do as well.
Right. And you mentioned assurance mapping earlier.
Yes. That's a technique that helps organizations get a holistic view of where their assurances are coming from.
Okay.
Think of it like a heat map for your risks.
Okay. So you can see which areas are well covered and which areas might need more attention.
Right. You want to make sure there are no blind spots.
Right. Now, the source goes into a lot of detail about the role of internal audit. What is its core function within this whole system of risk governance?
So internal auditing is defined as an independent, objective assurance and advisory service aimed at adding value and enhancing an organization's operations.
Okay.
It involves assessing and strengthening the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes.
So they're kind of like the internal watchdogs, making sure that everything's running smoothly.
Yeah. And the key word there is independent.
Right. They need to be able to provide an unbiased assessment.
Exactly. They review and evaluate how an organization manages its risks. And they compare the company's actual practices and controls against established standards.
Okay. So they're checking to see if the company is walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And if they find any gaps or areas of noncompliance, they discuss those findings with management.
Okay.
And then they agree on corrective actions.
So they're not just pointing out problems, they're also helping to find solutions.
Right.
And how do they maintain their independence?
Most organizations have an audit committee. which is a subcommittee of the board.
Okay.
And it's typically made up of independent, non-executive directors.
Got it.
This committee reviews reports and discusses risks with both internal and external auditors. And the head of internal audit usually reports directly to the chair of the audit committee.
Okay. So there's a direct line of communication to the board.
Right.
So what are some of the specific roles that internal audit plays in enterprise risk management?
Well, they provide assurance on the design and operation of risk management processes.
Okay.
They evaluate the effectiveness of those processes.
Right.
They review the reporting of key risks, and they oversee the management of those risks.
So it's a pretty broad range of responsibilities.
It is. But it's important to note that there are some things internal audit should not do.
Okay. Like what?
Well, they shouldn't be setting the organization's risk appetite.
Right. That's management's responsibility.
Exactly. They also shouldn't be imposing specific risk management processes, providing management assurance on risks, making decisions about risk responses, or actually implementing those responses.
So they need to stay in their lane and not overstep their bounds.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the discussion moves on to the 3 lines of defense model, which has evolved into the 3 lines of assurance.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this model?
So the original 3 lines of defense model, or 3LOD, was created by the Institute of Internal Auditors.
Okay.
And it provided a framework for how responsibilities for managing risk and maintaining control should be distributed within an organization.
Okay.
It typically depicted the governing body and senior management at the top, followed by the first line, which is business management.
Okay.
They are responsible for managing risks in their day-to-day operations.
Got it.
Then you have the second line, which is the risk management and compliance functions. They provide oversight and guidance.
Okay.
And the third line is internal audit. They provide independent assurance.
Right.
And some models even included a fourth line, which encompasses external auditors and regulators.
So basically a layered approach to risk management.
Yeah. The first line owns and manages the risks. The second line helps them develop and monitor the framework for managing those risks. And the third line independently assesses how effective that framework is.
Got it. But it sounds like this original model had some limitations.
It did. It was often criticized for being too siloed and not reflecting the reality of how organizations actually operate. There was also an overemphasis on defense against risks, which could sometimes lead companies to overlook opportunities.
Right. Risk isn't always a bad thing.
Exactly. And it was also found to be insufficient for providing adequate assurance in certain sectors, like financial services.
Okay, so that's why it evolved into the 3 lines of assurance model.
Right. The updated model is much more focused on collaboration and communication across all the roles.
Okay.
It's also more flexible and principles-based.
Yeah.
It recognizes that the lines between the first and second lines can be fluid.
Right. Because in reality, people in different roles often work together to manage risks.
They do.
Yeah.
And importantly, the word defense has been removed from the title to better reflect the dual goals of value creation and protection.
Okay.
And regulators and external auditors are no longer considered a separate fourth line.
So it's a more integrated and holistic approach to assurance.
It is.
Now, where do risk practitioners fit within this updated model?
Typically, risk practitioners are primarily in the second line of assurance.
Okay.
They're providing expert advice, developing frameworks, and supporting the first line in managing risks.
Okay.
But the lines can still be a bit blurry in practice. Someone in the first line might take on some second line activities or vice versa.
Right. It's not always so clear cut.
It isn't.
Okay. So that's internal assurance. What about external assurance? What's the role of external audit in all of this?
Historically, external assurance has been mostly about providing an independent opinion on an organization's financial health.
Okay. The traditional financial audit.
Right. But in recent years, its scope has expanded. Stakeholders are demanding more transparency about sustainability, ethical conduct, and what we call environmental, social, and governance factors, or ESG.
Right. So it's not just about the numbers anymore. It's also about how the company is impacting the world around it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this external assurance, like external financial audits, provides that independent third-party evaluation,
Okay.
which helps to build trust and credibility.
Got it.
This aligns with the idea of double materiality.
Right. Looking at both the financial impact of risks on the company and the company's impact on society and the environment.
Exactly.
Right.
And external assurance now often extends to areas like ethics, conduct risk, and corporate social responsibility.
I see.
There are also growing regulatory requirements and investor interest in reporting on things like climate change and other ESG issues.
Right. Those are becoming increasingly important to investors.
They are.
But the traditional financial audit is still a key part of this, right?
It is. External auditors continue to assess whether an organization's financial statements are a true and fair view of its financial position and whether they comply with accounting standards.
Okay.
And the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the U.S. actually mandates that external auditors verify management's assertions about the effectiveness of internal controls over financial reporting.
Right. So there's that extra layer of scrutiny.
Yes.
And the audit committee plays a role in overseeing all of this.
They do. They manage the process for tendering the audit contract. They advise on the appointment and removal of the external auditors. They evaluate their independence. They assess the effectiveness of the audit process. And they establish policies regarding any non-audit services that are provided by the auditor.
Wow. A lot of responsibility.
Here is. It's a crucial role.
And it's important to remember that external auditors are serving the interests of shareholders and other external stakeholders.
Yes, they're providing that independent view of the company's financial reporting.
Okay. Now let's go back to internal assurance for a minute. We talked about some of the sources of internal assurance earlier. Could you elaborate on those?
So internal risk assurance is basically the data and insights that managers and directors receive about the state of the risk and control environment within their organization.
Okay.
And there are 5 main sources.
Okay. What are they?
The measurement and monitoring of organizational culture, reports from various audits, reports from individual business units, unit performance evaluations, and documentation that's maintained by those units.
So it's a pretty comprehensive view of what's happening across the organization.
Right. And it's important to note that there's also this practice of self-certification of controls.
Okay. What's that?
It's also called a control risk self-assessment, or CRSA.
Okay.
Or in the financial services sector, it's often called a risk and control self-assessment, or RCSA.
Okay.
Basically, local managers in different areas periodically assess and report on the level of risk assurance achieved within their specific domain.
So they're evaluating their own risk management practices.
Right.
And how do they do that?
Typically through structured surveys, questionnaires, or facilitated workshops.
Okay.
They identify the risks in their area and evaluate the effectiveness of the controls that are designed to mitigate those risks.
So it's a way to get input from the people who are closest to the action.
It is.
And for more mature organizations, there are also key risk indicators.
Yes. Key risk indicators, or KRIs, offer a more dynamic and near real-time view of compliance and control effectiveness.
Okay. So instead of just a yes or no assessment, you have quantifiable metrics.
Right.
And those metrics can help management identify trends and potential problem areas.
Exactly.
So they can take corrective action more quickly.
Right.
Okay. Now, we've mentioned the audit committee a few times.
We have.
Let's take a closer look at its role.
Okay. So the UK Corporate Governance Code requires listed companies to have an audit committee.
Right.
And this is becoming increasingly common in non-public organizations as well.
I see.
The audit committee is typically made up of non-executive directors.
Okay.
And it's chaired by an independent NED who's not the organization's overall chair.
Got it.
It functions as a subcommittee of the board.
Okay.
And it has a pretty broad range of oversight responsibilities.
So they're kind of like the eyes and ears of the board when it comes to risk management and assurance.
You could say that.
What are some of their key duties?
Well, they oversee the integrity of the financial reporting process. They review narrative reporting, like the annual report.
Okay.
They monitor the systems of internal control and risk management.
Right.
They oversee the internal audit function, and they oversee the external audit process.
So a lot of responsibility for making sure that the company is managing risk effectively and that there's transparency and accountability.
Definitely. And the independence of both the audit function and the audit committee is crucial.
Right. So they can ask tough questions and challenge the status quo without fear of reprisal.
Exactly.
Okay. Finally, the source talks about organizational viability and the control environment. Why are all these risk management and assurance activities so important for a company's long-term survival?
Well, the main purpose of all of this is to give stakeholders confidence that the organization has a sustainable future, that it can operate as a going concern for at least the next 12 months.
Right. So it's about demonstrating that the company is resilient and can weather the storms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And accounting standards actually require companies to use this going concern basis for their financial reporting unless there's a clear intention to liquidate.
Okay.
And any significant uncertainties that could threaten that going concern status have to be disclosed.
So it's about being transparent about the risks that the company faces.
Right.
And this ties back to the concept of materiality.
It does. And the UK code actually goes beyond that immediate 12-month time frame.
Okay.
It requires boards to assess the company's prospects over a longer period and provide a long-term viability statement.
Okay. So it's about thinking strategically about the future.
Right. And again, this brings in that idea of double materiality.
Looking at both the financial impact of risks on the company and the company's impact on the world around it.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about the control environment? How does that fit into all of this?
So the control environment is the set of controls, processes, and attitudes within an organization that are designed to manage its risks.
Okay. So it's the overall framework for risk management.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And real controls are those specific measures that actively address and modify the risks that the organization faces.
So it's not just about having policies and procedures written down somewhere. It's about actually putting them into practice.
Exactly.
Okay. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So to mitigate the risk of employee fraud, an organization might implement data collection measures like pre-employment background checks and regular audits.
Okay.
They might also have clear guidance, like a policy on the prosecution of fraud, comprehensive staff training, robust accounting and asset protection measures, and mandatory employee leave.
So a combination of preventive and detective controls.
Right.
And it's the consistent and effective application of these measures that makes the control environment truly effective.
Absolutely. A strong control environment, underpinned by effective risk management and assurance processes, is crucial for ensuring an organization's long-term viability and building trust with stakeholders.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into risk governance.
Yes.
It's clear that it's not just about avoiding problems, but about building a resilient, responsible, and sustainable organization.